Last week, we began a discussion with World of Warcraft developer John Stotts and competitive gamers and international troublemakers Casey Chambers and Torin Wright about the stories that video games tell and the ones they inspire. This week, we conclude that conversation. Join us now.
Well, in my world of teaching students, my students enjoy gaming. They engage with it. They pay attention to it. They're great at it. They tend to do that instead of the lessons that they're supposed to be doing. But we know that school, the actual pencil to paper engagement, is sometimes difficult. And so what can educators learn from gamers about capturing attention and teaching lessons? John, how can teachers, writers, librarians integrate video games into the literacy curriculum?
Well, I don't know if it belongs in the literacy curriculum. I'm doing my best to get it in there. We'll see if it actually is a good way to learn about literature. But I think it's just understanding. It's still a barrier of understanding. A lot of people don't understand video games. I mean, how could you if you don't play them? And I think one of the things that attracts people to games, and not just video games, but all games, is that there's a lot of expectations, and it's a structured interaction with other people. And there's a lot of shy people out there, I think, on the fringes, the margins of society, or the margins of school society, shall we say. The nerds, they seem to be picked on a little bit more, and they're shyer for whatever reason. And the attraction that games hold is that it's a safe way to interact with other people. And I think that's one of the reasons why the same group of people keep playing games over and over, as that's a way of developing your social skills. If you're shy, or if you don't gel, or have a lot of things in common with the other kids, games are a way to level the playing field, so to speak. So I think that's just one of the first things that a lot of people fundamentally don't appreciate about board games and computer games, is that it's often a lot of people's first interaction with other people. So I don't know. I think that's probably one of the things that everybody can do. Mm-hmm. I've talked to a Canadian radio show. There's a hot button issue in Canada about trying to draw developers into Calgary in particular, and other cities in Canada. And the politicians there, they want to make tax incentives to draw companies up there. And in my experience, it's so hard to get good developers anywhere, regardless whether a programmer or an artist. It's because people don't like moving. And the best way to develop a computer gaming development industry is to actually foster it in education. That's really where it begins. Like, offer it in courses. I've looked at a lot of education courses, and they're just dreadful. They're usually grad students trying to do their best with what they have, but not really practical. No one with industry experience trying to figure out, how do we teach games? And it just comes down to, it's going to be a very slow rollout, I think, for education, actually preparing people for the computer game industry. If that's whether it's the cottage industry of developing your own games yourself, or joining a big AAA company. It's a complicated industry. So it does take a lot of education to learn to make art or to program.
Wonderful insight. I really appreciate that idea of that structured interaction with others and developing that social emotional learning. That is such a key component. And then, we talk about this all the time. We are behind the 8 ball with the next piece of technology and preparing our students for the 21st century. And so, we are falling a little bit behind. So I really appreciate your insight on that. What about you, Casey or Torin? Do you have any insight on, you're probably closer to the middle high school level than we are. What would have been a good thing for teachers to do to encourage you to read?
I totally agree with like the socialization kind of aspect. I wanted to even add on that a little more. Like, I mean, I guess not necessarily language arts, but like language in general. I think we teach a little too late in our like curriculums in the U.S. And I've had like so much experiences with video games where with people like all over the world, and it's so cool to like learn about other cultures. And I think that kind of having a little mini like culture shock within like a video game with like meeting people from different places is kind of cool to have. And I think for younger kids, it would be like great eye-opening experience to have like these opportunities, as well as like places in the world that may not get like much access to the internet besides video games. There are like some video games that I know that like help promote kind of these learning aspects in those areas that help them connect with the broader world around us. I know Casey wanted to say something more.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a background in the academic world of video game studies and how that applies to education. Thank you to Professor Caravella if you're listening. The way that video games can be a narrative and the agency that a player has within the confines of game structure, and I use structure in the academic sense of the confines of the game space, less so about like a physical map or a raid, but the ability to innovate within that space and to push the limits and to get the positive feedback and learning from interacting within a game can be very enlightening and very engaging. Games are rewarding, and that's why we come back to them. And in the education space, games that are properly designed to teach, educate, and allow individuals to engage within the game structure in a positive manner are really great. But unfortunately, as educators have tried to use games, it's been in a non-positive manner. Mm-hmm. And I think a perfect example for that is if anyone comes from the type-to-learn generation, that was a rote memorization, non-interactive experience that turned students off from education. Yeah. But allowing them the agency to do it themselves within a pre-designed model can be very rewarding and get kids into education in a way they wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that whole idea of agency of the player and the positive feedback. That is key. I mean, we want that as educators in any situation. We want that student to take on their learning, and having a video game situation where it keeps that balance, as we talked about before, that frustration versus disorientation, and it brings you back into that learning and owning it. That's the gold standard. We want that in every educational opportunity.
Yeah, I loved everything about all three answers to that question. Yeah. Really, I really did. And I mean, I'm jumping in here to talk about video games and education, two fields I know nothing about. However, as an observer, it seems to me that educators have kind of positioned themselves as against video games, right? Mm-hmm. Don't play video games. Yep. Go home and read first. Yeah. And so do the boring thing so you can do the exciting thing. Well, you just positioned your thing as the boring, right? And then, like you said, they want to so you create an educational video game, and you stand up in front of a group of kids and say, "We have something educational for you to do," and they all know that's code for boring.
Boring. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's got to be some ways that we are not, at least in the larger part of society and schools and talking about this at all, we're talking about it in all the wrong ways.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So getting off of that, John, can you tell us the story of World of Warcraft? Just like fast. How did this whole thing come about?
How did they make World of Warcraft? Yeah. Well, it was a long time coming. Really was just EverQuest came out. EverQuest was the precursor to World of Warcraft. And what they did is they visualized a continuous, persistent world where thousands of people could play in the same space. And that's really the fantasy of a massively multiplayer game, is a virtual world that when you log off and you're sleeping at night or you're at school or at work, that game is still going on for other people. And so when you log on and you're now caught up, you see whatever, how the game has changed, how everybody. So it's kind of like basically a virtual world. It's really our first, virtual world. And that idea just captured the minds of the developers at Blizzard, and they threw enough work at it and enough money at it that they eventually figured out what works and what doesn't work in that type of game. And that's pretty true with all the games that they've done at Blizzard, is that they just keep moving, fixing what doesn't work or abandoning it if it's a lost cause. And that's pretty much how all games are pretty much made.
Interesting. Except, you know what, John, I would be really mad. Like, the whole fear of missing out thing when you go to bed and everybody else is playing and having a grand time. How do you ever go to sleep then?
Oh, yeah. And it's kind of funny. What you do is you organize in groups. They call it stickiness. So World of Warcraft is socially sticky. And what that means is that you want to play not because of the prize, the rewards, or even your own progression or your own advancement. You're playing for the socialization. It's a chat room.
Yeah.
And you're hanging out, you're telling jokes, and you feel left out when you're not. And what people do is they will schedule events within your guild of people, whether it be 50, 60, maybe hundreds of people in a guild, and they'll go after this dragon. And everybody will organize the fight that they need to kill this dragon or take down this dungeon, and they'll schedule this. So I have friends that have a raid night where they can't go out. It's like a sports league or any other organized event, but it's all virtual. Everybody's sitting at home. They've got soda and chips. They've got their kids screaming in the background, and we're talking about from ages from, I would say in my guild, let's see, I think we had someone in their 70s playing, and we had someone's kid was in their teens, I would say 13 or something like that.
Okay.
So it's a wide range of cultures. And what's interesting about it is that normally I wouldn't have any interaction with everybody, like whether there's a guild from Minnesota or, from Hawaii, or you just find these little pockets of interest. And it's an interesting way to communicating with other people.
I want to jump on that. I read an article in, I want to say it was The Atlantic, but it may have been another publication a few months ago, about how video games are starting to take off among the over 65 crowd, because a lot of people can't get out at night. They can't see well enough to drive, or they don't feel comfortable leaving the house. But they really crave the socialization. So they learn to play video games. And there's this whole gray-haired, white-haired group of people
another subculture
who get on and play video games as socialization.
Wow, interesting.
Well, it's also the Atari generations getting older year after year. This
is true.
That's my generation. I think it's the same guys. Like when World of Warcraft came out, everybody seemed to be my age. It wasn't college students, it wasn't teenagers, it was the Atari generation seemed to be. And maybe that's just because that's who I normally socialize during the day, and that's how we find ourselves in the same guild. But I think it's just we're aging into it.
I can appreciate that. That's awesome. So Casey and Taryn, you shared a little bit about what happened in Hong Kong and how that's motivated you, and especially in your international studies. How did your gaming experience help inspire you to do what you did for human rights? You shared a little bit. Casey, I'm going to have you go first, and then Taryn, you can jump in.
Yeah, so a key lesson I learned from playing card games was that sometimes you just have to make bold decisions and accept the consequences where they fall. Obviously, in this case, for us, it worked out relatively well. It could not have, but we accepted that. So what specifically happened was on October 6th, Blitzchung made his statement for Free Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Time. And on October 8th, the very serious ban from Blizzard was handed down. That was the same day that we made our protest on stream. And in the next 24, 48 hours, it got a lot of social media, internet, and news attention. So we were able to ride that initial wave, give more concrete interviews at our statements. And then it happened that we were able to connect with Fight for the Future, which is an American nonprofit organization that deals with internet speech and rights. And what motivated all of our work and activism was two competing, or not two competing ideas, but just two different ideas. There was just the unfairness of what was handed down. Quite honestly, it was an unreasonable and unfair punishment that really didn't have any standing or grounds. And our perception, and I think a lot of people's perception, and there's some good evidence to believe it's accurate, is that statement wasn't handed down from Blizzard itself as an American company, but from the Chinese government. And that's concerning because, like I mentioned in the last episode, it is a serious issue that there is influence coming from other countries with different governance systems and different understandings of human rights that are able to influence the policies of American companies.
Sure.
And so part of our action was to promote the independence of American companies to support to make their own choices. Because quite honestly, I don't think in a world without China, Blizzard would have made a similar decision and punishment. And also just to stand up for Blitzchung, what was unfairly done to him. The ban, fortunately, was reduced, so he's actually back competing in Grandmasters, and he did have his prize money given back to him eventually after public outcry. There was positive reaction from Blizzard in the community, but Blizzard still hasn't addressed the concerns about the Chinese aspect and where the original ban came from. And that's unfortunate, but also not surprising.
Interesting. Torrin, any other thoughts on it?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to say, I'm pretty new to, I guess, the college scene for Hearthstone and I guess more professional style gaming in general. And I never really realized how much work really went into preparing and studying for the game. I mean, I'd more played casually for all my other games. When I saw the Blitzchung got his money taken away after winning a tournament, I mean, there's so much stress that goes in and work and time that goes into everything that it just invigorated me. That very first the very first article I read about it, I was just I can't believe it. I mean, it would be Toronto getting their trophies and prize money taken away after they won the NBA championship. Any other kind of sports thing, it'd be there'd be an outcry in those communities too. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was just kind of unbelievable to me.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's kind of helps those of us who aren't in the world of gaming understand that perspective. So I appreciate how you shared that.
Well, we have one last quick question. What is a metaphor to help us understand how video games and storytelling work together?
That's a great question. If I had to describe video games as something concrete, I would say it's it can be a passion or a life work. I mean, Torrin alluded to this, but the true top-level professional dedication to competitive gaming is uncountable amounts of hours and heartache. And even from where we come from, which was a competitive but not 12-hour day practice, because obviously we don't have the time for that, there was still a lot of work, a lot of time put into playing at the top of our level and also playing as a team. And even for people who don't exist in that competitive space, as John alluded to, the social aspect of games, including World of Warcraft, is formidable.
Yeah, it's kind of like bringing your your fantasies to life, but then having that like ripped away from you. I don't know, like I guess a metaphor for how video games and storytelling like work together would be like bringing your passion, your work, kind of like stuff you enjoy, and kind of telling a story about that, and kind of like telling like who you are like as a person. I say like video games, just like any other like passion or hobby in anybody's life, is kind of something that they hold like close to their heart. And I know like, at least for me, like it's been something that's allowed me to connect with my friends more, and I'm still in touch with them because of video games. And I'm really glad that stuff from video games and like other programs like Discord and like Skype have kind of keep in touch, like whether that be like through video games, or like I'll just kind of hop on and listen to them play the video games and like rage and stuff, and just have like a good old time, you know?
Okay.
John, what'd you think?
Amy, have you ever heard of a book called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud?
No,
Do you have a pencil? I want you to get this ready.
Tell.
I know a guy who taught in NYU. Every class, he recommended that book. It's called Understanding Comics, and what it does is it looks at comic books, but it also organizes storytelling just as a whole.
Okay.
And what storytelling really is it's a way to project yourself into a fantasy.
Ooh.
And you do that with movies. And they organize this book organizes that type of interaction with a media in such a way it makes it so clear. But even though it's about comics, it really does have implication in movies, in books, and in just any type of media. And like one of the things you'll notice is that actors have very generic features. It's easier to project yourself into the role of the action hero if that action hero just looks like the average person. You
Sure.
know, it doesn't. There aren't any distinct features that are going to remind you, oh, that's not me. You know, that type of thing. And that's true with all things. Sports, football. When I'm watching football, I'm projecting myself as the guy catching the football. You know, that's why I'm excited, even though I've not played football in decades, and I'm just sitting on the couch enjoying myself, and that's how people interact with these medias. And computer games are like that.
Sure.
I think computer games, they're vehicles for immersion. And when people say storytelling, that is actually what a lot of people, when they say they like the story to a lot of games, what they actually appreciate, if they had the vocabulary, they would say that they like the immersion, the amount they're able to project themselves into the fantasy of whatever that game is. And so I don't know if it's actually an equivalent media, like you would say with books, how you can project yourself into a book. But they do share common traits in, I think, immersion, like a book or like a sports game or a movie. The audience projects themselves into that position of the protagonist or the quarterback or the author of a book. So I think take that for what it is. But I would also recommend, Scott McCloud, Understanding Comics. I would recommend that book. It's a very good book.
Wow. I am absolutely thrilled with this metaphor. The whole idea of projecting yourself into fantasy and a vehicle for immersion, that completely makes sense. That does dovetail with what Torin and Casey said about this idea of passion and connecting and that feel and touch. You know, those things all are part of it. And, you know, as we kind of close up and wrap up this episode, I'm coming back to this idea of social emotional learning and that positive feedback, that culture of interaction, and this idea of something being socially sticky, you know, because obviously if it wasn't and you didn't project yourself into this fantasy, you didn't feel that connection, we wouldn't have a 600% increase. We wouldn't have these billion-dollar industries, but we do because there is something to it. Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate these metaphors tonight.
Yeah, that's fantastic. John, tell us one more time about World of Warcraft Diaries.
World of Warcraft Diary is a book that I wrote about making World of Warcraft from notes that I took for 4 years. I compiled everything and gave the audience a fly-on-the-wall perspective on what it's like to make a computer game. If you think that might be cool, there's lots of pictures that haven't been published before in it. There's captions and everything. So you can check it out on Amazon.com.
Awesome. Very good. Thank you. Well, this has been an exciting conversation. Thank you all so much, Taryn Wright and John
Casey
Stats
Chambers.
and Casey Chambers. I'm having a moment here. I think I just got starting to project myself into some of these conversations. So it took me a minute to reel myself back in.
Thank you for joining us at the table for a conversation about the intersection between video games and storytelling with John Stotts, Casey Chambers, and Taryn Wright. This has been fantastic. Next week, we'll be talking about how to tell and leverage your personal story with guest Oleg Lohid. Oleg is the founder of Overcoming Odds, an organization committed to helping people learn how to tell and leverage their own personal stories. Oleg is also a TEDx speaker and a podcast host, and that is going to be a great topic. If you've not subscribed to the Afterword podcast at theafterwordpodcast.com, please take a moment and do that. Then you'll be up on all the latest Afterword information with links to fabulous guest resources. And as always, remember that you are welcome at our table.